The year was 1865, and the frontier stretched farther than courage dared to follow. The wind carried the scent of gunpowder and rain over the wide yellow plains, and the sun fell like a dying ember across the land. In that stillness rode Eleanor Hart, her shawl drawn tight against the dust, her brother Samuel perched beside her on the wagon bench. They had left behind Missouri's smoke and graves, chasing whispers of peace beyond the edge of the known world. What they found instead was Stillwater Crossing, a place that seemed carved out of silence and suspicion. The settlement rose from the earth like a half-formed promise. A handful of shacks, a weather-beaten trading post, and a saloon that leaned against the wind. Horses snorted along the hitching rails, their hides streaked with sweat and dust. Men stood in the shade, narrow-eyed and slow to trust. When the Hart wagon rolled in, conversation faltered. Eleanor kept her chin high. She had learned, after the war, that dignity was a woman's only armor. Samuel, barely 17, grinned through the tension, the kind of grin that belonged to boys who thought bullets were always meant for someone else. Inside the trading post, the air was thick with smoke and the sour tang of sweat. Shelves bowed under sacks of flour, tins of tobacco, and bolts of faded cloth. Behind the counter stood a man with a scar, like a lightning strike down his cheek. "New here?" he asked, his voice low, gravel dragged across stone. "Just passing through," Eleanor said, though the truth was less certain. Her money would last no more than a month, her strength perhaps less. The man's gaze flicked past her to Samuel. "Passing through's safer than staying," he muttered, then turned to serve another customer. Outside, the wind shifted. A rider approached, a man in a brown duster, hat pulled low, dust rising in a halo behind him. He rode like someone who'd forgotten how to rest. When he dismounted, Eleanor caught the glint of a revolver at his hip, the kind carried by men who'd seen too much. He nodded once briefly as their eyes met. "Ma'am." "Sir." That was all, but something in his tone, quiet, steady, edged with loss, made her heartbeat stutter. Later, she'd learn his name. Daniel Royce, once a captain in the Union Army, now a ranch hand for hire. He spoke little, drank less, and watched everything. The kind of man who seemed part of the land itself, scarred, enduring, impossible to move. That evening, as the sky bled into twilight, Eleanor and Samuel made camp on the edge of the settlement. The prairie stretched out before them, endless and gold, whispering secrets to the wind. Samuel hummed an old tune from home, the kind their mother used to sing when storms rattled the windows. Eleanor smiled faintly. "You'll scare off the stars singing like that." He laughed. "Ain't no harm in making the night less empty." But emptiness was the one thing the frontier never lacked. From beyond the ridge came the echo of distant hooves. Daniel appeared out of the darkness, reins loose in one hand. "Best keep your fire low," he said. "Tensions are high. Horses have gone missing. Folks are looking for someone to blame." Eleanor studied him through the flickering light. "And who do they blame?" "Whoever's standing closest." His eyes flicked toward Samuel, then softened. "You should keep inside the light. The dark out here, it listens." He tipped his hat and disappeared into the shadows as quietly as he'd come. The next day brought heat and unease. At the trading post, voices rose and tempers cracked. A settler shouted that the Cheyenne had stolen horses again. Another swore he'd seen white men riding painted ponies to stir up war. The air trembled with the promise of violence. Eleanor felt it in her bones, the same brittle tension she'd known back east right before cannon fire. Daniel stood apart, jaw set. When Eleanor caught his eye, he gave a small, warning shake of the head. But words had already become weapons. A sudden shout split the noise. "Thieves! They're here!" Then came the sound of a rifle cocking. Chaos erupted. Men drew guns. A shadow moved by the door. A young Cheyenne man stepping forward, hands raised. "No fight," he said. "We come." The rest was lost in the first gunshot. The blast tore through the room. Smoke filled the air. Eleanor ducked, dragging Samuel behind a barrel, with splintered bottles shattered and the smell of gunpowder bit at her throat. Someone screamed. Then another shot rang out, closer this time. Samuel tried to stand. "Stay down," she hissed, clutching his sleeve. But the boy's courage burned too bright. He broke from her grasp, darting toward the door. The world slowed. A muzzle flashed. The sound hit her like thunder. When it cleared, Samuel lay still on the floor, dust settling over him like a shroud. Eleanor crawled to him, her voice breaking on his name. The room blurred through her tears. Daniel was there, grabbing her by the shoulders, pulling her to her feet. "We have to go," he said, his tone firm, his eyes filled with something that might have been sorrow. She didn't move. Couldn't. Her brother's blood soaked her skirts. A man outside shouted. They started it. The woman's boy, he was helping them. Daniel cursed under his breath and dragged her through the back door. Bullets snapped past. The heat of the day burned away beneath the cold edge of panic. They stumbled down an alley, across a corral, and into open fields before the gunfire faded into echoes. When the silence returned, it was heavy, suffocating. The prairie stretched wide and empty under a dying sun. Eleanor sank to her knees. Her voice cracked, barely more than a whisper. He was just a boy. Daniel knelt beside her, hat in hand. "I know." She turned on him, eyes fierce with grief. "You fired the first shot, didn't you?" He didn't answer. The truth hung between them, raw and unspoken. The wind rose, carrying the smell of dust and death. He looked at her, really looked at her, and what he saw seemed to strike something deep within. "You shouldn't have been here," he said quietly. "Neither should you," she replied, her voice low, steady. He nodded once, as if accepting the weight of both their sins. "We'll bury him at dawn." And they did. Beneath a sky bruised with morning light, Eleanor knelt over the fresh mound of earth. The horizon glowed red, as if the sun itself burned in mourning. Daniel stood a few paces away, silent, the wind tugging at his coat. When it was done, he offered her water. She didn't take it. Her gaze stayed fixed on the east, where the world stretched on without mercy. "What will you do now?" he asked. Eleanor rose slowly, her shawl whipping in the wind. "I'll keep moving," she said, "and I'll never run again." Her voice was calm, but her eyes held the storm. Daniel watched her walk toward the waiting dawn, and in that moment he understood. Grief had not broken her, it had forged her. The prairie swallowed her figure, the light catching the edge of her hair like flame. Behind them, Stillwater Crossing lay quiet once more, its silence thick and waiting. But somewhere in that stillness, something had shifted, something that would not be silenced again. The dawn came harsh and cold, the kind that scraped breath from the lungs and burned the eyes. Eleanor Hart rode beside Daniel Royce through a sea of grass that shimmered like molten gold beneath the early sun. Behind them, Stillwater Crossing was no more than a smudge of smoke and memory. They hadn't spoken much since the burial, but words seemed unfit for what they'd left behind. The silence between them was not empty, it was heavy, alive, carrying all that could not be said. By noon, the wind turned against them, carrying dust from the south. They followed the trail that cut through a stretch of hard, cracked earth where even the scrub refused to grow. Daniel led with his revolver visible, eyes scanning the horizon, his instincts sharp as barbed wire. Eleanor rode close, wrapped in her shawl, her face drawn but unbroken. Every sound, a distant hawk cry, the creak of leather, seemed sharpened by the vastness around them. They stopped by a dry creek bed to rest the horses. Daniel crouched near a patch of wild sage, studying faint tracks in the dust. "They're following," he said quietly. "2 riders, maybe 3. Settlers from Stillwater, I'd wager." Eleanor's hand tightened on the reins. "To hang us for what they started." He nodded once. "They won't stop until they have someone to blame." She knelt beside him, her shawl brushing the dirt. "Then we don't stop either." Something in her tone, steady, resolute, caught him off guard. He glanced at her, seeing the faint tremor of exhaustion beneath her strength, the grief that hadn't dulled but hardened into purpose. "You're not the same woman I met 3 days ago," he said. "I buried her," she replied, and mounted her horse again. They rode west until the sky burned with evening light. The plains opened wide, endless as a promise and twice as cruel. When night came, they found shelter in the ruins of a burned-out way station. The roof had caved in, but the stone walls still held the day's warmth. Daniel built a small fire, while Eleanor unpacked what little food they had left, dried beans, hard bread, and silence. As the flames flickered, he watched her from across the fire. The light caught the edge of her profile, the curve of her cheek, the shadow beneath her eyes. She looked like someone carved out of endurance. "You've seen war," she said suddenly. He nodded. "Fought in it. Killed for it. Believed in it once. And now, I believe in keeping people alive," he said, "even if they don't thank you for it." She met his gaze. "That's not belief. That's penance." His jaw tightened. He looked away, tossing another stick onto the fire. "Maybe it's both." They didn't speak again until the night deepened and the stars came out, cold and endless. Somewhere beyond the ridge, a coyote cried. Eleanor lay awake, staring at the fire's dying glow. Daniel sat with his back against the wall, hat pulled low, pretending to sleep. But neither rested. Each was haunted, one by guilt, the other by loss. When morning came, they moved again, keeping a low ground. The land changed, rolling hills, scattered pines, a river whispering through canyons of red stone. The air grew thick with the scent of rain. Daniel's instincts stirred, uneasily. "Storm's coming," he warned. By afternoon, thunder cracked across the sky. Rain fell hard, drumming against the earth, turning trails into rivers. They found shelter in an abandoned cabin half hidden by cottonwoods. Inside, it smelled of rot and old smoke. Daniel barred the door, lit a small lantern, and spread out their gear to dry. Eleanor stood by the window, watching the rain streak down the glass. "How long can we keep running?" she asked. "Long enough to survive," he said. "And after that?" He paused. "I don't know." She turned from the window, her voice soft but unflinching. "You saved my life, Daniel, but don't think I've forgiven you." He nodded, accepting the weight of it. "I wouldn't forgive me either." For a long while, they listened to the rain. Then, slowly, Eleanor sat across from him. "Tell me about the war," she said. "Not the battles, the men." He hesitated, then began. "They were boys, mostly. Same as your brother. Thought they'd come back heroes. Instead, they came back hollow or not at all. I gave orders that buried some of them. That's a thing you don't wash off." She studied him quietly. "So, you left the army?" "I left myself," he said. The storm raged on. Hours passed. When the fire burned low, she reached across the space between them and took his hand. It wasn't affection, not yet. It was recognition. Two souls burned down to the same ember. By morning, the world smelled new again. Mist curled over the river, and sunlight scattered through wet leaves. Daniel saddled the horses, while Eleanor filled their canteens. When she looked at him, there was something different in her gaze, not softness but trust. They followed the river west, its current fast and cold. At one crossing, the bank gave way beneath Eleanor's horse. She plunged into the torrent, the water roaring around her. Daniel was off his horse in an instant, diving after her. The cold struck like a hammer. He caught her arm, fought the current, dragged her toward the far bank. They tumbled onto the mud, coughing and shivering, clinging to each other. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Eleanor laughed, hoarse, breathless, but real. "You can't seem to stop saving me." He smiled faintly. "You make a habit of needing it." Her laughter died, replaced by something raw and unspoken. They sat there, soaked and shaking, the river rushing beside them, like time refusing to stop. That night, they made camp on higher ground. The moon hung low and red. Eleanor stared into the fire while Daniel cleaned his revolver. "Do you ever think about stopping?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Every day." "And why don't you?" He reassembled the gun with quiet precision. "Because something worse always comes if you do." She watched him, the firelight carving gold into his face. "You think running is the same as fighting. I think staying alive is," he said. Silence followed, deep and almost tender. When she finally spoke again, her voice was low. "Maybe you're right, but I'm tired of surviving. I want something worth the pain." He looked at her then, really looked, and for the first time since the war, he felt something stir that wasn't guilt. By dawn, they found new tracks, fresh horses heading their way. Daniel's expression hardened. "They're close," he said. "We can't outrun them this time." Eleanor's jaw set. "Then we don't run." He stared at her, then shook his head. "They'll kill you. Then I'll die standing." Something fierce flickered in his eyes. He nodded slowly. "I'll draw them off. Give you a chance to reach the Cheyenne camp north of here. They'll protect you." She felt the words strike like cold iron. "You'd face them alone?" He smiled, weary but sure. "I've been alone a long time." She wanted to argue, to beg him not to go, but the words tangled in her throat. Instead, she reached out, pressing her hand against his chest, feeling the steady beat beneath his coat. "You don't have to be." He covered her hand with his own, calloused and warm. "We'll see each other again," he said, though they both knew the frontier wasn't kind to promises. Then he mounted his horse and rode toward the rising sun, the wind at his back and her gaze following until he vanished into the horizon. Eleanor stood alone beside the river, her shawl fluttering in the morning light. The land was vast, silent, unyielding, but she no longer feared its stillness. Somewhere beyond the hills, men were coming, death close behind. She turned north, gripping the reins, her voice a whisper swallowed by the wind. "Then let it come." The morning light broke thin and cold across the plains, pale as a memory. Eleanor Hart rode north along the river, her shawl stiff with frost, her mind replaying the moment Daniel disappeared into the rising sun. Every hoofbeat carried her farther from him and closer to the uncertain promise of the Cheyenne camp. The world felt too large, too still, and every shadow whispered danger. But she kept moving. Fear had long since become a companion she knew by name. The air smelled of smoke before she saw it, a thin column rising beyond the ridge. Her pulse quickened. She dismounted and climbed the hill, each step heavy with dread. When she reached the crest, the sight below stole her breath. The Cheyenne camp was in ruins. Teepees burned. The river shimmered red beneath the dawn. Bodies lay strewn like broken prayers. The wind moaned low, carrying the ghosts of the fallen. Eleanor stumbled down the slope, calling out, but no answer came. The only sound was the crackle of dying fire. Among the wreckage, she found a child's doll half buried in mud, its cloth face scorched. She sank to her knees, grief rising in her throat, and in that moment, she knew Daniel's warning had come too late. Someone had wanted this war to burn again. A voice carried from the far side of the camp, rough and familiar. "Didn't expect to see you here, Miss Hart." Eleanor spun around, her hand on the pistol Daniel had given her. A man stepped into view, tall, broad, his coat bearing the insignia of the Union Army long since turned to tarnish. Colonel Briggs, Daniel's former commander. His eyes gleamed with cold amusement. "Royce mentioned you once. Said you had a stubborn streak." Her voice was low, steady. "You did this." He smiled, like the question was naive. "Peace is a fragile thing. People need enemies to remember who they are. This land's worth more when it bleeds." She raised the gun. "You murder them." Briggs stepped closer, unhurried. "Don't waste your anger on me, ma'am. The world's built on graves. I just make sure the right ones get filled." Her finger tightened on the trigger, but before she could fire, a voice rang out across the clearing. "Eleanor." Daniel stumbled into view from the treeline, his face drawn, his coat torn by travel and fight. Relief struck her like a blow, followed by terror. Behind him came riders, half a dozen men with rifles raised. The same posse that had chased them from Stillwater. Briggs smirked. "Looks like your soldier boy kept his word." Daniel's gaze swept the carnage, then fixed on Briggs. "You did this." "Of course," Briggs said. "And now I'm here to finish what you wouldn't." Daniel stepped forward, the wind lifting the edge of his coat. "You want me? Leave her out of it." Briggs shook his head slowly. "Oh, Daniel, you still think this is about mercy. You never did understand the frontier." He raised his hand. The riders fanned out, surrounding them. Eleanor moved to Daniel's side, her voice a whisper. "How many bullets?" "Not enough," he muttered. The first shot cracked like thunder. Dirt exploded near Eleanor's feet. Daniel shoved her behind a fallen wagon and returned fire. The air filled with smoke and shouting. Horses screamed. The gunfire roared until it was all sound and motion, rage made visible. Eleanor fired blindly, heart hammering. She saw one man fall, another clutch his shoulder. Then Daniel's revolver clicked empty. Briggs advanced through the haze, pistol drawn, his smile fixed and cruel. Always said you were too soft, Royce. Thought maybe war would carve that out of you. Daniel lunged, tackling him into the dirt. They grappled, rolling through blood and ash. Briggs's pistol went off, once, twice. The shots echoed like breaking bones. Daniel gasped but didn't fall. He drove his fist into Briggs's jaw again and again until the older man stilled. Eleanor rushed forward, grabbing Daniel's arm. "We have to go." But Briggs wasn't finished. He lifted his gun, eyes burning with spite. "You'll die out here, both of you." The shot came fast. Eleanor didn't think. She moved. Her gun flared, the report deafening. Briggs staggered back, surprise flickering across his face before he collapsed. Silence followed, heavy and complete. Daniel stared at her, chest heaving. "You!" She lowered the pistol, her hands shaking. "You said it yourself. Some things don't wash off." He tried to smile, but pain cut it short. Blood stained his shirt, dark and spreading. "It's just a scratch," he said, though his voice trembled. Eleanor pressed her hand against the wound. "Don't lie to me." "I'm not," he whispered. "Not anymore." The remaining riders fled into the distance, their courage dying with Briggs. The sky cleared, the wind easing into stillness. Around them, the land fell quiet again, the kind of silence that came after storms. Eleanor tore a strip from her shawl, pressing it to his side. "Stay with me," she said. "You're not leaving me in this godforsaken place." He caught her hand, his grip weak, but sure. "You came back for me." Her throat tightened. "You'd have done the same." He nodded faintly. "Guess we're even then." They stayed like that until the sun climbed high, turning the smoke to gold. Daniel's breathing slowed, steady but shallow. Eleanor looked toward the horizon, where the land seemed to stretch forever. "We can't stay here," she said softly. "If we do, we'll be ghosts like the rest of them." Daniel managed a half-smile. "You always did have more fight than sense." She laughed once, brokenly. "Then it's a good thing you've got neither left to argue." He winced as she helped him to his feet. Together they walked toward the river, each step a test of will. Behind them, the camp smoldered, the last remnant of another war that wasn't supposed to happen. Ahead, the plains shimmered with heat, endless and cruel. They found an abandoned barn before dusk. The roof leaked, but it kept out the wind. Eleanor tended his wound as best she could, her hands steady, her jaw set. When she finally sat beside him, exhaustion settled over them like a blanket. For a long time, neither spoke. Then Daniel turned his head, his voice barely a whisper. "Why'd you come back?" She stared at the fading light, through the slats. "Because I was tired of running from what mattered." He nodded slowly. "Guess love's the only thing stubborn enough to survive out here." Her hand found his. "Love doesn't survive," she said. "It fights." Outside, the wind had stilled. The land lay quiet beneath a blood-red sky, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Somewhere in that silence, the frontier seemed to shift, not softer but truer. It was no longer just a place of death and ruin, but of endurance. Weeks later, when the grass began to grow back through the ashes, a cabin rose by the river. Eleanor planted wild sage out front. Daniel built the fence with slow, careful hands. The scar on his side would never fade, nor would hers, but the land around them began to feel less like punishment and more like promise. At sunset, she stood on the porch, watching the light fall across the plains. Daniel joined her, his arm brushing hers. "This place," he murmured, "you think it can ever forget?" She looked out toward the horizon. "No," she said, "but maybe it can forgive." The wind carried their words into the distance, fading into the hush of twilight. And somewhere in that stillness, love, scarred, stubborn, unbroken, fought back once more.